Welcome to APA's weekly webinar. My name is Billy Zydick, Manager, Special Projects for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to APA's webpage later this afternoon. You'll receive a follow-up email in the next couple of days with a link to the webpage where all webinar recordings are housed, as well as a link to our upcoming webinars. We have webinars planned out through November 2021, and they are open for registration. Professional continuing education and AIACLU credits are being offered for today's program. If you are an AIA professional requiring a certificate, please send an email to me at Billie, B-I-L-L-I-E, @apa.org, along with your AIA membership number if you've not done so in the past. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by our presenter. If you are just calling in, make sure you send an email to me at Billie@apa.org so I can send you a certificate if you requested one. The system only recognizes you if you log in. Before we dive in, let's get to know today's speaker. Darren Foote is the president of Remediation Training and Consulting and LearnToRestore.com. He spent the last 3 decades in the insurance repair industry, starting his career owning a property restoration and construction company based in Reno, Nevada. After growing that business to multiple states on the West Coast, he sold it to Belfor and spent 12 years as their Director of Training and Technical Training. He currently owns an education company focusing on the IICRC training, subrogation training, and all aspects of the property and insurance restoration industries. Darren is very active with the IICRC and is currently the Vice Chairman for the WRT Technical Advisory Committee and the Vice Chairman for all IICRC remediation and restoration standards. He was listed as a contributor for the 4th edition of the IICRC S500 and was a consensus body member for the latest 5th edition of the S500. The consensus body has spent several hours each week for the past 4 years updating the S500. He is excited to share the updates to the latest edition. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Darren. Darren, take it away.
Billie, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's good to be with you today. And Kelly, I know you're in the background making things happen as well, so thank you. As was mentioned with the AIA continuing education slides, there's some information there that Billie's already gone through. Today, we're going to be talking about changes to the S500 and some basics of water damage restoration. Moving forward, talk primarily about the changes from the current version. According to ANSI, it needs to be updated every 5 years, and so that's just happening in this year in May. We're going to talk about categories of water, class of loss, again, lots of general changes in the versions or updates, and then a little bit about meters and how you know when the job is complete. For those of you not familiar with the IICRC, it's a nonprofit organization, and their mission is to establish globally recognized standards, and there's many of them. We'll be talking today about the S500 for water damage. There's the S100 for carpet cleaning and 300 for upholstery cleaning, and the S520 is mold, and the S540 is trauma cleanup, and the S700 is coming out. That will be for smoke. And so there's many, many standards that are out there, and that is the purpose of the IICRC, and then to create certification courses for technicians that are performing these services. On the history of the S500, just to be aware of it, it was first published in 1994. And it was about a 1/4 inch thick document. It was a standard and a reference guide. And then the second edition came out in 99. It was about 18 pages on both of those of actual standard language. The 3rd edition came out in 2006, but something very significant happened where it received its ANSI accreditation. And we'll talk about that on the next slide, but that was a significant change on the value of the standard. 4th edition, November 2015, and as I mentioned, the 5th edition just came out in May of this year. We're supposed to every 5 years, we got a slight extension and pulled it in about 5.5, 6 years to get that done. The standards are written by, for example, the S500, written by restoration contractors and professionals, insurance professionals, attorneys, chemical manufacturers, equipment or formulators and equipment manufacturers, and many people were involved with that. Thousands of hours and many years of all volunteer, except for the staff that helps us get to it. If I can get my mouse to the right spot, we'll move to the next slide here. On ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, ANSI doesn't care what's in the S500. They are not water damage professionals. What they care about is how it was put together. That you don't have people in there that have an agenda, that want to get something that says in there because it will benefit them in some way. And so the process for ANSI is many subcommittees put together the information. It goes to what's called the consensus body, which is in essence the authoring body. They complete it, and then it goes out for peer review to anybody in the industry who's interested. And then they'll send in comments in a format and say, I agree with this, but you need to change that. I disagree with that. It should be this. And the consensus body has to review and respond to every one of those thousands of comments and say, yes, we agree, we're going to change the language. We understand, but don't agree, we're not going to change the language. We have a committee working on that. We're looking into that, and they have to respond to each of it. If the peer review causes any substantive changes in the document, then it has to go out for another peer review. And that will keep going until all the peer reviews are satisfied. And if it isn't, there's an appeals process. So the reason I mention all this is because once it's gone through and become an ANSI accredited document, it holds the weight. If you ever have an issue with a restoration contractor, an insurance company, how something's done, it's going to come down. If there's ever a complaint, litigation, arbitration, it's going to come down to what the S500 says. That is the document for our industry that says this is what prudent restorers throughout the industry, throughout the world, and it is an international document, are doing. So it's a very important thing that happened with that third edition. Some definitions to be aware of in all of the standards globally. One word is shall. If it says you shall do this, you shall not do that, that means that it is mandatory. It might be a federal regulation, it might be a natural law, right? If I jump up in the air, I shall come back down. Law of gravity, nothing I can do about it. Should says that it needs to happen. It's part of the standard of care. And if you don't do it, you've deviated. You're not in compliance. It's not a natural federal law, but it is mandatory to be in compliance with the standard of care. There's also three other words. One is recommended. That is considered what we call trigger language. That it's important, it's suggested or advised, but if you don't do that, you haven't violated or I guess I should say deviated from the standard of care. There's also the terms may and can. May means it's permissive. It's not part of the standard of care, but yeah, you may do that. And can means it's possible. Yeah, you can do that, or this can happen if you try that. So those are throughout. So we'll talk again today about some of the changes as we've gone from the 4th to the 5th edition of the S500 document. Initially on principles, it tells us that initially on drying goals, it had percentages for various materials. It's much more generic now. It does say that we should establish drying goals, or what we're going to dry the affected materials down to, that would get it to a state that will inhibit microbial growth and return to an acceptable moisture content level. And obviously a lot of built materials and finished materials have recommendations or requirements by the manufacturer that says if you're going to install this over that, then it has to be at this moisture content level. And so that's what it says. That's what your goal needs to be based on. It also tells us that, some of these I know I'll read, and most I'll kind of paraphrase, but mitigation, emergency services, following water damage should begin as soon as possible, because if you don't, then potentially microbes are going to amplify. You could have allergic and toxic and infectious issues with some of the people that are in those buildings. I'm obviously paraphrasing that. This is language that came from the reference guide into the standard. The new standard no longer has a reference guide. Anything that was in the reference guide was moved into the standard if it was a should or a shall or recommended, and if not, it was moved to the appendix, which we'll briefly talk about later. So moving through the sections, on section 7 with antimicrobials, one of the changes there was initially in 2015, there was quite a few specifics on how to apply chemicals on job sites, antimicrobials or biocides. Those were removed, and now it just pretty generically says you shall use them according to label directions. Now that's a shall because there is federal law. If there's FIFRA and EPA that regulates these microbes. Also, it's important that when you're using an antimicrobial, you don't just spray it on somewhere. that you document. And anytime you use it, you should document. This is the chemical that I used. I used it in this dilution ratio. I used it in these areas, because later on, if someone claims that they're sick because it was a modified phenolic or a chlorinated, or it was a thymol based or something like that, you can say, no, this is what we used. There are some products that will be damaged. CPVC pipes and some antimicrobials will cause those to crack over time. So it's very important, you can't use a fungostat on a sewage job, because that's bacteria. You don't want to use a bacteriostat or bactericide, I'm sorry, on a mold job, because that's for bacteria. So make sure you read the label, understand what it says, the correct usage, if you can or can't fog it, the dwell time, how long it needs to stay on the product, on the material, to have an effective kill rate based on what it is. It does retain, this didn't change, but I want to point it out because it's important. It retains the language, not all water intrusions warrant the use of antimicrobials. If it's category 1, it hasn't changed, and by definition, which we'll get into, it's not going to cause substantial health risk. There's really no reason to introduce chemicals. It's clean water, and you're going to dry it out, and typically would not be a reason to introduce chemicals into that environment. Section 8, safety and health. It still talks about asbestos, not significant changes there. It did bring some information in from the reference guide, and actually says, here's a list of some things to be aware of. I think most people know that asbestos, although it was banned by the EPA through a series of lawsuits, that ultimately those bans on existing uses were overturned in a court of appeals. And right now, while we're having this webinar, somebody's out there putting on some drywall texture that has asbestos in it. Now, asbestos is amazing. It performs incredibly well. It's a great binding agent. It's heat resistant. It's friction resistant, abrasive resistant, but it kills people. And so we don't want to use it anymore. Those that are now using it, it won't say on the label of the joint compound, for example, contains asbestos. It will say mineral additive or binding agent or chrysotile secret ingredient, but it is still in use today. And so we need to be aware of that before we cut into it, because that could potentially cause some health impacts on some people. So just a list of some places that it might be. I know with what all of you do, you're very familiar with this, what they hear and things like that. Also note that it says in the standard that it doesn't matter what the detectable limit of asbestos is. In other words, a lot of people say, well, if it's less than 1%, we don't have to worry about it. Recognize that EPA and OSHA, although they're very aligned in many things, have a different objective and focus. OSHA says we want to protect the guy that's in there tearing out the drywall, that they don't get asbestos exposure. And EPA says, yeah, and we want to know where he's going to dig, where he's going to dump that stuff when he's done ripping it out. And so EPA, I believe, says if it's less than 1%, we don't really consider that asbestos-containing material. But OSHA says if it's detectable from a standpoint of removal, then it needs to be treated as such. So be aware of those laws and regulations. Section 9, not a lot in some of these. This one just talks about documentation. There's actually quite a bit that was changed and added to this as far as documentation. But one thing it talks about here, it changes. We used to talk about moisture content all the time, and now we talk about moisture content or moisture level. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we get into meters. But that is a very important thing. Moisture content is a percentage of the moisture in the material by weight. And so if you're using a non-penetrator or a non-invasive meter, some people call it a scan meter, like the one shown here, those typically, depending on the meter and the material, typically are not capable of giving a moisture content. And so it's comparative scale, which we'll talk about here in a few moments. But when you look at that, you don't want to call that a moisture content because it technically isn't. And so the S500 suggests that people refer to that as a moisture level. And a lot of people call it points. So instead of saying it's 15% moisture content, you would say it has a moisture level of 83 points or whatever it happens to be. So an important distinction on that. I do want to talk a little bit about categories of water damage. This is just such a critical part of every job that we work on and what we're doing. And so the category refers to the range of contamination in the water. It has to do with where the water came from, how long it sat there, what it flowed through, and odors may indicate a change in the category. Now that doesn't mean if something smells that it's gone from a category 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3, which we'll talk about definitionally here in a moment. If you get plywood wet, you're going to smell it. We have a golden retriever, and Duke's a great dog, but when Duke gets wet, Duke stinks. When Duke dries out, Duke doesn't stink anymore. So it's not that there's something bad with the water, it just exacerbates odor. Temperature and humidity always bring out odor. And so if it's just a wet material smell, that's not such, except telling you something's still wet and the job's not complete. It's where you're getting a pungent odor like bacteria, or that musty odor from mold is where it tells you you might have an issue or a problem. So again, the category of water says, where did it come from? Out of a single supply line, from a toilet, from a rainstorm. How long has it sat there? What's the time impact? Time is always my enemy on water damage. The longer it sits, the worse it gets. Temperature will have an impact, and it could be good and it could be bad. Just like if I put my chicken salad sandwich in the fridge, I can have it for lunch tomorrow. If I leave it on the counter, I'm not going to chance it. I don't have that kind of confidence in it. So if it's really cold and the building's cold, that will delay or inhibit microbial growth. But if it's very warm, that could exacerbate or enhance microbial growth. So temperature will have an impact. And other pre-existing conditions. What's the structure being used for? How's the housekeeping in there? You know, if it's a veterinary clinic, you're probably never going to have a category 1 job, which we'll talk about because of what happens on those floors and how they clean them. So again, the 3 categories of water damage are category 1 and category 2 and category 3. Now, oftentimes you'll hear people refer to clean water, gray water, and black water. And the reason that we don't use those in our industry is because they give an idea that what the water looks like is what the water is. So if you're driving a motorhome or a travel trailer, those are appropriate terms. You wash your hands, you use some soap, and it goes into the gray water tank. You use the toilet, it goes into the black water tank. Very descriptive and very accurate. But with us, you can have very pristine looking water that has microbes or other contaminants that could make you sick up to dead. And so because of that, we don't want to give any illusion to what the water appears. Yes, sometimes you can look at the water and say, Dad, that's bad stuff, without a doubt, but not always. And so we use category 1, 2, and 3. Definitions. Category 1 originates from a sanitary source and doesn't pose substantial risk to humans. So a broken supply line, for example, it's that whether the supply line goes to the sink or the dishwasher or the ice maker or the washing machine, that's all the same water you could use as a supply system to make soup. Not going to hurt you. So tub or sink overflow with no contaminants. You haven't put in dog wash or bubble bath. Melting snow or ice and falling rainwater. Now that means that originates as a category 1. You know, we go out and we walk through the rain, we don't feel like we need to run to the hospital, and we catch snowflakes on our tongue and we're okay. But if that rainwater comes to an attic, interstitial space, and there's a lot of pigeon droppings or bat guano or something else going on, certainly that's going to change in category. But initially, that would be a category 1. A broken toilet tank with no additives, so it doesn't have the little cleansing tablet, little tidy bowl, something like that. But initially, that's part of the supply system. Now, if I open the tank and there's a lot of corrosion or growth, yes, that will certainly have an impact. But those initially would be some examples of a category 1 loss. I hear a lot of times people say there's no such thing as a category 1. Once that water hits the carpet or any building materials hits the backside of the drywall coming down the wall, it's no longer category 1. If that was the case, there would not be an identified category 1. There would be no point for it. And so what it states in the standard is, yes, category 1 can deteriorate to category 2 and eventually category 3, given time and temperature and the things we talked about. But category water that flows into an uncontaminated building doesn't immediately change it. So an example I would use on that is in our home, it's well maintained. We take care of it. We vacuum. We have a dog. We get the carpet cleaned. If I came into my home and I tripped and fell and there was a water damage, the carpet was soaking wet, and I tripped and fell and some of that went in my mouth, I would not enjoy that, but I wouldn't run to the hospital and think I was dying either. Now, I have been in some homes where they've clearly changed out a transmission or two in the living room, rebuilt them, and I would be very concerned if that got wet and got in my mouth. But the point is, just because it touches materials does not immediately mean that we're in an environment day in and day out that's cleaned, and the custodial staff is there, and things are. If it's a healthy environment to be in, walking through, and it gets wet, it's not going to automatically make that an unhealthy environment. But certainly there's factors that could impact that. On a category 2 job, this by definition is water that contains significant contamination. So it's a big deal. It has the potential to cause discomfort or sickness if contact or consumed by humans. And so some examples would be a discharge or overflow from a dishwasher or washing machine. Now you've got clothes that have soil and dishes that have food, and you're adding in detergents. If that overflows, you've created this wonderful little soupy smorgasbord for the microbes to grow and thrive in. Overflow from a toilet bowl with some urine but no feces. So you've got, somebody flushes the toilet after urinating and the flapper valve doesn't engage correctly and it just keeps coming from the bowl to the tank and overflowing. Is that disgusting? Yes. Is it contaminated? Yes, it's actually significant contamination. So some people say, why isn't it category 3? Because category 2 is significant contamination. Another example would be broken aquariums, some really nasty stuff in there. It's significant. It's a big deal and needs to be properly taken care of. Want to point out here, I have a lot of people that from my class have come back and said, hey, Darren, I'm on a job. There's some fecal matter. There was something in the toilet, on the toilet paper, whatever. I don't want to get too graphic, but I'm looking all in the definition of category 3, which we'll get to in a moment, and it doesn't say anything about feces. It talks about sewage, but not feces. And so I think it's category 3, but it doesn't say it. Correct. The S500, the way it's worded is sometimes it'll be direct and say this is what it is, but sometimes you have to find out what something else isn't. For example, in category 2, it says urine, some urine, but no feces. Therefore, if there is any amount of feces in there, it's no longer a category 2, and there's only one place to go from there, and that's category 3. And so in that instance, it would be category 3, not because category 3 says it is, but because category 2 says it isn't. Some things on category 2. Carpet padding has to be removed. And if you're going to clean the carpet, it needs to be, or save the carpet, which you may do, it needs to be cleaned first. And then we get into category 3. Grossly contaminated, contains pathogenic, toxic, and other harmful, icky, nasty, yucky, gross, disgusting things. Again, I'm paraphrasing just slightly on that. So sewage, a wasteline backflow that originates from beyond the trap, regardless of visible content or color. Talk about that here in just a moment. All forms of flooding from seawater and rising water from rivers and streams, and wind-driven rain from hurricanes and tropical storms. Those are all going to be a category 3. If I have category 2 and above, so 2 or 3, I should have containments in place and pressure differentials so I'm not ever cross-contaminating an unaffected area. Be very careful about that. If it's a category 2 loss by virtue of the standard, then carpet pad, as I mentioned, is gone. Internally lined ductboard on your HVAC system needs to be removed and discarded. External insulation on a metal ducting would need to be removed. Wall and ceiling insulation, particle board and MDF, medium density fiberboard, those will absorb the contaminants in. And we'll talk more about this next in a minute, but multi-layer floor system. So if you, and that's if it's over wood. So laminate and sheet vinyl and parquet engineered, if those are over a wood substrate like plywood or OSB oriented strand board, those need to come out. We'll talk more about that. Category 3, by virtue of the S500, says if you've got gypsum wallboard, so sheetrock and drywall, ceiling tiles, wood paneling, carpet, anything that is highly porous needs to be removed by virtue of the standard. Also category 3, full personal protective equipment. So respirator and eye protection, gloves, and probably a Ceranex or PVC suit if you're going to be in wet areas. Contents isolation, so you don't take contaminated contents and put them in an area that's not anything that's porous, like I mentioned, and then you clean. And then if you use an antimicrobial, it's after the cleaning, and at that point you can start the structural drying. So water can change categories, as I mentioned, from a 1 to a 2 to a 3. If it does, you open up a wall and there's a bunch of mice in there or mice droppings in there, how old it is, where it's gone through, or the time that's gone by. Now there's no longer a time frame in categories like there was 3 standards ago, but with odors and other things. If you have a question, you can get a hold of an IEP, an indoor environmental professional, a third party to do some testing and verify what needs to be done. In addition to that, we have what's called regulated hazardous materials and mold. This just simply says that if in the water, for whatever reason, there's some arsenic or some asbestos or polychlorinated biphenyls or pesticides or whatever, that's no longer a category 1, 2, or 3. That has to be taken care of by people who have the licensing to do that correctly. And mold lumps into this as well. Basically what it's saying is if you're on a water job and any of these things are present, that gets priority. You've got to deal with that first and then move on. Some of the changes to the category. This is not a change, it's a clarification. In the 2015 edition, categories of water was defined 4 times in 4 locations with 3 different versions, with an oversight by the committee. So this is just taking the correct one. So if you've got a waistline backflow beyond any trap, so it doesn't matter if it shows up in the toilet, if it comes out of the sink or anywhere else, the tub, it is a category 3. If it's gone beyond the trap and mixed with what's going on, not because it went through the trap, although that could be kind of yucky, it's a technical term, but if it goes beyond the trap and mixes in the sewage and it gets pushed back into any fixture, it's going to be category 3. It used to, in one of the areas, it said all of the forms of contaminated water, flood water. Now it took that out. If it's from seawater, rising water, rivers or streams, etc., it is category 3. Another oversight was in one of the places it said that if it's wind-driven rain, if they carry trace levels, and what it was meant to say, and the correct version was they can carry. So it's not, it's definitely a category 3, and in addition to that, it can carry these trace levels. It's not category 3 if it happens to have some in there. So that was an important clarification. Section 10, it talks about the importance of humidity control. And so even if you're in a contaminated area, you still need to get that humidity control. It might be with dehumidification, it might be through ventilation or air exchanges, but we want to control that humidity just as soon as we possibly can so it doesn't make things worse. Section 1068, performing the initial moisture inspection. This is an important language. It says restorers should be trained in the proper use of the meter, understand the literature or the guides to it, and have an understanding of its use and limitations in proper operation. I see so many reports as I'm looking through files where people clearly had no idea how the meter works. So they put it somewhere and it gives them a number and they write it down and they have no idea what they're doing. And so it's just very important that they understand how to do that. If you're using an unaffected, I talked about it before, if you're using I'm not unaffected, a non-penetrating meter or a scan meter, a non-intrusive meter, whatever you want to call it, those are only utilized in the scan mode to compare one area to another area affected versus unaffected of the same material. When you put it on, it sends out a signal. It has no idea if you're putting on a plastic or metal or concrete or tile. It just sends out a signal and reads it and comes back and says, I'm assigning this a number. So one way to look at that is kind of like a gas tank. The gas tank's going to be different on a Prius and a big old truck. And this does not tell me how many gallons I have. It doesn't quantify it. It just says, hey, this is full on this side and this is empty over here. You're getting close to empty. You're going to want to put some gas in this thing. A non-penetrating meter doesn't quantify it. It says the dry area on this particular material, the unaffected area, is this number. And the affected area is this number. And you want to dry it down to that or tear it out. Also be aware that these meters have different ranges depending on the manufacturer. Some go from 0 to 100, some go 0 to 300, and some go 0 to 1,000. So you can't use one meter one day and another the other day because because it's just comparing. It's not giving an action. The number means nothing without comparing it to something else. So one way to look at this, if someone said, hey, Darren, how on a scale of 1 to 10, how beautiful and wonderful is your wife? Should be a 10. If the scale is 1 to 100, should be 100. But if someone said, how beautiful and wonderful is your wife, and I said 10 because I'm using a scale of 1 to 10, and they're using a scale of 1 to 100, they're going to get wrong information about how I feel about her. And so it's critical that we understand these limitations and what we're talking about, how to take the readings and where to take the readings. That we can get false readings on any meter, especially if you're using non-penetrating on metal, where there's corner bead or metal studs or ducting, plumbing. It won't read through an air gap. Also, the meters, the penetrating meters, for example, are designed for a certain material, usually Doug fir, at a certain temperature. And so if you are using it outside those temperature ranges or on a different material, they'll have a chart that says, here is a temperature correction and here's a species correction. And you have to look at that or you're in. Now, a lot of the meters now have those corrections built in. You have to set it and say, I'm using it. It's this surface temperature and this, and it will do it for you on this species. But if not, you're not getting good information. So you really need to understand the meters that you're using or you're going to have some bad data. Section 12 on structural restoration. And I know there's a lot of words on some of these slides. Basically, it's saying initially that if it's category 1, no substantial risk, you don't have to worry about initial cleaning or worker protection. They've realized, well, yes, you do have to clean, not decontaminate, but if you've got drywall dust on the carpet, anything that could become aerosolized or come up in the air when you turn on your equipment needs to be cleaned off. And worker protection, even if it's not contamination, they need goggles and nitrile or latex gloves or whatever. So that's a change. It added this whole diagram of walking through, not the way you have to do a project, but some really good information on kind of the flow of the water damage. There's a big emphasis now on humidity control. We used to talk about bringing dehumidifiers to start the drying process. Now we're saying sometimes the drying process won't start for a couple of days. And we have to, we do what we call stabilization. I've got to wait for an asbestos results. I've got to get a demolition permit, and I may not. I've got to remove all the desks and all the file cabinets and all the contents that are in there, and that's going to take 2 or 3 days. Well, I still have to start controlling the humidity right away through ventilation of the outside if the conditions outside are good, or through bringing in dehumidifiers. But that humidity will go to other places and cause other problems. When we talk about humidity control, we have what's called the class of water intrusion. Not a lot of changes on well, not really any change on this, but I do want to make sure you're aware of it. The class of water has to do with the estimated evaporation load or potential evaporation. So you're saying I've got wet materials, how much water potentially is going to come out of those materials every day that I've got to remove from the air. Because if I don't pull it out of the air, it's going to seek what we call equilibrium. It's going to soak into books and documents and drywall and paintings and all sorts of other things and cause damage, what we call secondary damage to those. So this rate of evaporation has to do with the permeance of the materials. Water's not, if you got a vinyl wallpaper, that wet drywall is going to stay wet. I have no evaporation or very, very little because it won't go through that. The porosity of the materials. Carpet's very porous. It's going to release that moisture very easily. Hardwood, not porous. It's very dense. It's going to be taking more effort to get it out of there. How much wet surface area is there? How many wet surfaces that are going to be releasing that moisture, and the level of saturation, how deeply penetrated. So real simply, what we're saying is what kind of materials are wet and how wet are they, because that's going to determine how much moisture is coming into the air that I've got to capture in my dehumidifier or push to the outside through ventilation. So the classes of loss are very straightforward. Class 1 says you've got a drying chamber or environment. Whatever, the way I look at it is any air that could be affected or affect your dehumidifier or your ventilation system. So if I'm in a room that's partially wet and I close the door, that room is my drying chamber or my environment or my space. If I put up plastic and now only half the room's affected, that's my drying chamber. If I open the door and it goes out to unaffected areas, that's now part of my drying chamber because it will impact it. So if less than 5% of the overall surfaces, walls, floors, and ceiling are wet, that is a class 1 loss. Limited evaporation, limited dehumidification required. If between 5 and 40% of my walls, floors, and ceiling are affected, now that's called a class 2 loss. I'm going to have and this is my wet porous materials, not talking about wood, deeply saturated wood and things like that. We'll talk about that here in a moment. I'm going to have more wet materials, more evaporation, more dehumidification. And if it's more than 40%, I have a potential for a lot of evaporation taking place, and therefore I need the most amount of dehumidification to counteract that and capture it. Class 4 changes gears. It's not about a percentage. It's about the type of material that's affected. So it's deeply held or bound water. So this is where I've got low evaporation materials or assemblies. It is soaked into concrete or wood or plaster, or assemblies where it's under a hardwood floor, which of course would be wood. We talked about elevator shafts, multiple layers of drywall for firewalls, things like that. Those are very difficult to dry. So if I have a room that's a little bit of wet hardwood, or an entire room or entire gymnasium of wet hardwood, those would be a class 4. It's the type of materials and how difficult it is to get the moisture to release and evaporate from. They're called low evaporation materials. They don't want to let that water go, and we have to work differently to get that out. Just a note in section 12, it's always said that extracted water needs to be disposed of according to local laws. You don't dump it down the gutter, that goes back into the river or the system. We don't want three-eyed fish. It also has just added the terms handled and transported. It might be illegal for you to suck up sewage and drive it across town, depending on your local laws and regulations, is all that's indicating there. So, again, humidity control. If we're using what's called negative pressure, we'll show an example out here in a moment. It said before that might increase dehumidification because you're taking your dehumidified air and pushing it outside. But if you're also taking the vapor and pushing it outside, you might not need as much or any dehumidification. We call that an open or combination drying system. So just a slight clarification that if the outdoors are conducive to drying, I might need less or no dehumidification equipment to accomplish that initial humidity control. This is just something that's interesting. We've always said that you don't get your completion, you don't do the remediation until after you've dried the project, but there's some testers, IEPs, who say, look, I'm not going to clear a category 3 or a mold job if the floor is still wet and it's conducive to growth. And so this just says, yeah, it's okay to dry under control. If you're under containment, negative pressure, then yes, you can run air movers. You have to dry it to get your final clearance. And that's an appropriate methodology in those circumstances, as long as you're controlling and not cross-contaminating. This just, a lot of words here that says you should, this change the language, you should do a post-remediation evaluation. Now, please understand that by virtue of the standard, there's 2 words that they use exclusively in here. Evaluation is something that's done by the contractor or the cleaner. Whoever did the work should go evaluate and say, is there visible dust and debris? Does it still smell in here? Do we look like we got it? In addition to that, if you want to do what's called an assessment or get it verified, that's when you would call in that independent IEP or indoor environmental professional, a third party. So what it's saying is, You always should. Every job you should do a post-remediation evaluation to make sure you've done your quality control. And the next slide is going to show where they recommend that you get an IEP. So if there's occupants or high risk, public health issue, likelihood of adverse conditions, or if you had a test at the beginning of the job and determined it's category 3, then they recommend it. It does go on to change a little bit of the language and say, and there's some duplication here, but it says on a category 3, you should retain an IEP if these are part of it. Occupants or high-risk individuals, so the elderly, and there's more information on that, and a public health issue. So elderly care, child care facility, public buildings, so right in your domain, hospitals, all those things are saying if you got category 3, you should get it tested when you're done to make sure for efficacy and verification of that project. Just more information on stabilization, that it used to say control humidity, now it says control humidity and temperature. So depending on the type of year, the type of loss, then you might need to bring in coolers, you might need to bring in supplemental heat, but you want to get within those areas where you're not getting below dew point temperature and causing condensation. You're not getting up to where it's too warm, you're going to cause microbial growth. It just says we recommend that if you're using abrasive tools to sand and cut, that's hooked up to a vacuum or a HEPA filtration system, so it's not going all over the place. One of the issues is if someone tries to clean up, for example, mold or sewage with a regular shop vac, that's not a HEPA vac. It's just going to aerosolize or spread stuff all over the place. So all the words on here just says you should evaluate and clean materials regardless of category. So when you're starting your drying process, you're not blowing stuff around that's going to become an issue. Oftentimes on a job, because of that, and because as materials, we first try and clean off subfloors and carpet and things, but the drywall and the particle board that came out was wet. It's still sticking because it's moist. As we dry it out, it releases and it becomes aerosolized or airborne. So that's when you use an AFD or an air filtration device. Sometimes they call it a negative air machine or a NAM or a scrubber. That's just how it's utilized. It's a motor and a fan. It's got 3 layers of filters. It pulls out particles in the air as well, depending on the filter, odors and gases. And it can create a pressure differential, what we call negative pressure. I'll talk about that here in just a moment. So you've got a pre-filter for the big stuff. Those are relatively cheap. A secondary filter for the smaller stuff, still relatively inexpensive. And those can be organic, like an activated charcoal to pick up odors through the air. If you're working on a sewage job, you don't want to throw up in your respirator. That's never a good day. So you want to capture those both on your respirator and your AFD. You'd want to have charcoal activated. And then your primary HEPA filter, which is picking up 99.97% of particles down to 0.3 microns, a micron being a millionth of a meter. So pretty darn small stuff down there. When we talk about negative air, it's a cross-contamination. I'm doing some work on someone's home in the master bathroom. I'm ripping up mold. Mold spores are so tiny they can go through outlet covers and under walls. So I turn on my AFD and I push it outside. It becomes a negative air machine. And if I'm pushing air out, then I have to be able to bring air in to make it up. And as I do that, the mold spores cannot fight against that airstream and they won't cross-contaminate. So it tells us on category 1, if you can't clean it and there's potentially going to be things in the air, then it's recommended that you install an AFD. And that was a can, and now it's a recommended, but it's an important consideration. It also talks about, we're not going to go into it, but there's a lot of information that came in from the reference guide on evaporation from surfaces and velocity of airflow and constant and falling drying rates and moisture migration, even over drying materials. And so there's some things that were brought up that are very important. Controlling airflow, it adds that you have to have airflow on all your materials to get them dry. That's part of the equation. And it added the language also into interstitial spaces, wall cavities, and under hardwood floors if it's not glued down and things like that. So that's critical. However, it also tells us that if you can't sufficiently clean, or if you're pushing air through an interstitial space, or there's high-risk occupants, then you need to have, it recommends that you have an AFD. You look inside this, anytime you're drying in an interstitial space like a wall cavity, you have to assume there's contamination. Is there just construction debris? Is there rodent droppings? Is there, is there other chronic or water damage, chronic leaks or water damage that has mold you don't know about? And so you always want to control that airflow and assume it's contaminated. It talks about the HVAC system as a resource, and it basically says, a lot of people say, hey, turn on the air conditioner, that will dehumidify. Correct, but it's not engineered to dehumidify with an enhanced moisture load that would show up from water damage. You need to have dehumidification or ventilation. It might help and assist, but it's not going to handle it. And I'm moving a little quickly because I'm watching the clock, so we're okay, but I want to get through things. Just inspections and monitoring, which is so critical. It says normally, now it says check for moisture level or content. And also, there's some people say, well, if the dehumidifier isn't putting out, we talk about this in our classes, but if it's not doing enough grain depression or you can't read, the problem with the grain depression methodology, I know we're not talking about here, is that it's the meters are not that accurate, and so it's a bad reading. What it's basically saying is, look, we know our dehumidifier is working because things are drying out. If the moisture level or content is dropping, we know that it's working properly. When it goes back to meters, because it states in section 12 also, because different types of meters, because of calibration issues, then either use the same meter or have some in-house methodology through calibration or other to know that if you send out one person with one meter and another person next day, it has to be the same type, same brand, same type of meter, that you know you're getting the same type of readings. So otherwise, it's not good information. It jumps in 13 back to HVAC. It said in the past, if you have condition 3 is active mold growth or category 3 like sewage, then you've got to remove and replace with new materials. Now it simply says microbial contamination, which could include category 2. So a little more vast on what it's saying you need to be aware of on levels of contamination and bringing category 2 into it as well on your HVAC, especially on ductwork, anything like that's going to go. It said previously that contaminated HVAC systems should not be used for dehumidification. All they did is took that out and said they shouldn't be used for anything. If the HVAC, the lungs of the structure, which is designed to uniformly move air, including what contamination's in that air, if it's contaminated, don't turn it on. Don't try and use it for dehumidification, for cooling, for heating, for whatever, until it's been cleaned and decontaminated, or you're going to cross-contaminate. This just goes on. It said on contents that most porous contents should be removed. Now it says they should be disposed of if they're not generally storable. It does say, you know, household fabrics and things like that. Yes, those can typically be cleaned. You know, washing machines, submersion washing, but not a teddy bear, not, you know, things like that. There's always ways. Anything can be preserved. You can do gamma radiation depending on the value of what it is, but generally speaking, those should be removed. This is a really important consideration you need to be aware of. It says that if you have an engineered wood as a subfloor or a substrate, so plywood, OSB, etc., and it gets water damage, it should be checked for moisture migration, and if it's occurred, then if it's engineered, they recommend that you have a specialized expert like an engineer make sure that it hasn't affected the structural integrity of that. This is the part that was already in there but significantly clarified. Now that doesn't mean the plywood or OSB needs to be replaced as a subfloor. It's fine for that. You can even clean it with category 3. But what it says is if category 2 or 3 water has migrated under a finished floor over a wood subfloor, then that has to be removed. It applies to vinyl sheet and VCT and LVT and plank, hardwood, residential and commercial, engineered laminate, stone, granite, tile, engineered marble, all those. It says if it's over wood and category 2 or 3 gets below it, those finished floors are removed, discarded, so that you can clean, sanitize, and dry and inspect the subfloor. It's a significant change. Now, it's interesting that for performance sports and dance floors, like a gym floor, they did give a little bit of wiggle room on that. Before it said category 2 and 3, they have to be removed. It now says in the case of category 2 water intrusion, a specialized expert can consider if it can be restored. So it does open that up. If you get some category 2 water under a $4 million gym floor, you don't have to tear it out for the standard. You do have that little bit of wiggle room there. So, elevators, some basic language that an elevator pit's the lowest part of the building. It's going to pick up all the gunk. And so it's going to be a category 3 kind of right off the bat and could be regulated hazardous materials. Fire suppression systems, there's a lot of comments on this. A lot of people say, oh, if the fire suppression, the sprinkler system goes off in the building, it's category 3. No, not necessarily. There's a lot of factors on that. Now, if there's some additives and things, what it says is we recommend you get a hold of whoever, the company or individual who maintains it to find out how long it's been since it's been maintained and had maintenance done on it. Are there any additives like an antifreeze or something? What kind of a system is it? Some older systems, and this would be going back a while, could contain ethylene glycol. This was actually added to the regulated hazardous materials list. This is some nasty regulated stuff. And so if it's in there, you need to know it and not just put it down the drain and have your people slopping through it. It's going to be an issue. Propylene glycol is a food-based additive, probably won't cause you any problems, but ethylene glycol for sure is a concern. It's on fire suppression systems. Before it said it might change to category 2 or 3 if it's not connected to non-potable source. I've seen them that are connected to swimming pools. So it's just saying it can be. It's possible that that is a category 2 or 3 right out of the chute. But it does say if it's connected to a public water supply, there's no additives, there's no other indications of contamination, you can actually consider it category 1. And a lot of people would argue with that, but they're saying start by assuming it's category 1, and then if there's other factors, you move from there. And it also says, if you look at that second to the bottom line, that you should consider dilution. When it first comes out, it is just a dark, nasty looking, but if it's just some grease that's in, I don't want to say just some grease, but that's going to blow out and look really bad. But the amount of water that's moving through that system is going to dilute that contaminant. Now, if you dilute bacteria, you can't really dilute a bacteria spore in the right conditions can, as I understand it, can double every 4 to 20 minutes. So it's not really diluting, it's growing. So that's a different animal there. Well, it's not an animal. Okay, I'm getting off track. Anyhow, just look at the dilution, look at the whole impact. Don't just automatically say category 2 or 3. Cabinets and built-ins is just saying that, like anything else, you need to identify and eliminate moisture behind built-in cabinets and fixtures. And if it's category 2 or 3, you need to go back to category 3 or 3, which means you'd have to remove it. You can't clean and decontaminate behind a built-in cabinet or fixture if it's back there and it needs to be cleaned or decontaminated. So just be aware of that. In crawl spaces, when you run across those, before it just said be aware of vapor barriers, and now it says you need not just be aware of it, you need to pull it back or make sure that that moisture is coming out, that you're not locking. Some people will pull the vapor barrier out, suck the water up, and put the vapor barrier back down. Well, if you're locking that moisture in, it's going to eventually work its way back out. It should be back to the normal amount of moisture in that area for the season that it is all that it's saying. It also says you should control that environment, temperature, relative humidity, dew point, air pressure, all that stuff in the crawl space as soon as is practical. So you're not pushing that wet, humid air or contamination somewhere else in that cross-contamination, and again, causing other problems. And it's interesting. It says if the outdoor conditions are good per the standard, then you should use an open system or combination. And so you always should look at Mother Nature first and say, how are you going to help me? And then go from there as you're looking through it. The appendix, everything was in the reference guide is either moved into the standard or it'll go into a new reference guide that's being done. There is an appendix that has 3 items in there. It is not part of the standard. It's not ANSI approved. It did not go through the process. And it's reminded over and over that if it's in the appendix, it's just ancillary information. Appendix A is the assembly materials table. Great information, really important stuff, but not part of the standard. Example B is dehumidification for 2 ways to figure out the minimum amount of dehumidification recommended to start a project. And C is removing and re-engaging carpet for drying when you're trying to save the carpet. So I want to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions on this. I will wrap up with simply saying, the longer it sits, the worse it gets. We read this before. I want to read it again. Mitigation following water damage events should begin as soon as safely possible, or microbial contaminants can grow and amplify, posing an allergic, toxic, or infectious disease health risk to both occupants and restoration personnel. I want to point out, I'm not saying, and the standard's not saying that will happen, it's saying it can happen. It's possible that that could be the result, and we want to get it done as quick as we can. Billy, that is what I've got. I wanted to, like I said, leave a few minutes for questions at the end if anyone has any.
Well, we have one question. I'd like to remind our attendees to type if you have a question for Darren, just type it in the chat box and we'll get to it here in a moment. Our first question is, if water enters the basement through a foundation window during a storm, does the carpet in the basement have to be removed?
That's a great question. In the third edition of the S500, it actually had the phrase groundwater. If it's groundwater, it's category 3. That was removed in 2015. And the reason for that is to give some latitude on that. So no, that's not a should. That if it touches, if you got water that goes down past the basement, it gets a little bit of carpet wet, and that could be cleaned. Probably not. If the water came through the trees and through the parking lot, and through whatever else, and you say that's category 3, then it's not about the water coming across the ground through the basement. It's about the determination of category. And in that instance, would not automatically be a category 3. So potentially that the pad would go, but the carpet could potentially, if you're calling it category 2, be saved, cleaned and saved.
Okay, we have our next question is, do you have a recommended moisture meter?
That I mentioned earlier that I have a dog, and apparently he's protecting me from Amazon downstairs, so I apologize for the background noise. There's several that I've used. I would stay away from the really inexpensive ones. The major brands out there are going to be, Protometer is very good. They've got all sorts of meters. Delmhorst is very good. I'm very familiar with both of those. I've used Tramex and also FLIR bought X-Tech, and they put out some good ones. So I mean, there's other ones out there. GAN is a very good meter, but I would stick with one of the major players in the industry because they have better information. They've done a better job of bringing it to our industry, in my opinion.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, our next question is what type of PPE do you need to wear for a Category 2?
So Category 2, it doesn't specify completely in here. We actually are coming out with a field guide that will have some more information. So I will say for me personally, the way I understand it is you have at least an N95 respirator. You're going to want splash goggles. You're going to want some sort of protection on your hands. You have to have a Tyvek type bodysuit, a spun bundle, not necessarily. But for me personally, I'm actually going to be in a minimum of a half face HEPA respirator, P100 respirator. So you could do an N95. A lot of people do. It doesn't specify that. It's kind of your comfort level on that. But it is enhanced PPE. Realize that the water is contaminated, and that means there could be some things in the air. So maybe not a great question, not as good of an answer as a question, but that's about what I got for you. So.
Okay. Our question is, and if you need to contact this person directly, I'll send you the information. If you wanted to start your IICRC training, where would you recommend to begin?
Well, I'm really not here as a commercial, but there's a lot of very good trainers out there. That's what we do. That's our focus. And so I would tell you to look at the screen, but I want to be careful about not, there's a lot of good people out there that train, but that's what I've decided to do with my background. So if you want to take it from us or not from us, if you reach out to me, I will be happy to answer any questions and steer you in the right direction.
Well, thank you. Well, right now, it doesn't look like we have any further questions coming in. So I'll begin to close out. So Darren, thank you so much. This is our second or third of our webinars we've done together, and always thank you for the very professional and great information you provide. To our attendees, as always, thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to be with us. So until next time, be safe, stay healthy, and be kind to one another. Thank you. Bye-bye, Dan.
Thank you.